walk you through some ideas from my book called The Heresy of Heresies, from the first chapter. And this particular section is 1.2.2 of chapter 1. And in the last video, we walked through some arguments from G.K. Chesterton about how common sense reality is just obvious. You might be thinking, after those logical arguments, I'm not sure how obvious it is. Philosophers try and make things precise, and we do that in terms of logic as well. So this section is going to cover an argument from a French philosopher named Etienne Gilson. Gilson in English, I guess you say. I don't really parler français too good. So Gilson, Etienne Gilson, French philosopher, one of the people most responsible, I think, for reinvigorating the study of medieval philosophy in the 20th century. Fascinating figure, and I highly recommend anything you can get your hands on by him. He's got a little book called Methodological Realism, and at the end of that book, he's got a little section called A Handbook for Beginning Realists. And that's the last chapter of his book, Methodological Realism. And I encourage all my metaphysics and epistemology students to read that book and reread it. So let's look at, in this video, we're going to look at three arguments that Gilson offers for common sense realism. Okay, so here, these are kind of three different distinct steps or arguments that he works through. And these arguments will set the student on a realist path. Okay. So step one, recognize that you've always been a realist. Let us assume that step one is the conclusion of an argument, that you've always been a realist. What would the evidence for this conclusion be? Could be the conclusion of an inductive generalization from past experiential reflection on your own life, right? So you just reflect on your own life and your past sensory experiences or internal reflective experiences. And from that, you generalize inductively that you've always been a realist. Okay. If we reflect back on our grasp of what is, we will see that we've always been realists in our approach to reality. We've always lived our lives as realists, and Gilson hints at this generalization of cognitive experience when he states the following. So this is a direct quotation from Gilson's Methodological Realism Handbook for Beginning Realists. Quote, "The awakening of the intelligence coincides with the apprehension of things, which as soon as they are perceived are classified according to their most evident similarities. This fact, which has nothing to do with any theory, is something that theory has to take account of. Realism does precisely that, and in this respect is following common sense. This is why every form of realism is a philosophy of common sense." Okay, so let me say something about that quotation, at least part of it. One of the things that points out is the apprehension of things. Like when you see the sky, you see the trees, you see water, or rocks, or a fence, or whatever else, a hat maybe, sunglasses. The computer in front of you, your phone, whatever you're watching this on, right? You're apprehending something. You're grasping something with your intellect and receiving it into your mind, within your soul. The soul becomes all things, as Aristotle says, right? You receive the qualities of the object, the essential qualities, along as with its accidental qualities. If that distinction is not clear, we'll talk about that later, or you can watch some videos online. You can find plenty of these. I think it's the Thomistic or Aquinas Institute has great videos which walk you through those distinctions. But when you apprehend things, you perceive them, right? You really grasp them. Now, notice what he says next, that action, doing that, has nothing to do with theory. Nothing to do with theory. You don't have to be a philosopher to make sense of your common sense experiences. You just have them. Everybody does. Everybody knows what it's like to have an ordinary sense experience. This isn't like some mysterious, esoteric, Gnostic sort of like, mystery cult sort of thing. It's just like, dude, you have common sense experience. That's it. That's all there is to it. And he says that theory has to take account of this. So any theory has to begin with ordinary sense experiences. And that's why you've always been a realist. You always have been. You can't escape it. Good luck with that, as they say. Okay. All right, step 2. That was step 1. You've always been a realist. Here's step 2. Recognize that however hard one tries to think differently, one will never manage to. That's a quote directly from his methodological realism. Okay, so this step looks kind of like a conditional claim, maybe a sort of argument, or the premise of an argument, and maybe the argument that flows from this conditional claim has the form of a hypothetical syllogism. Hypothetical syllogism is just an if-then statement followed by another statement and then to a conclusion. Okay. So here's the argument that seems implicit in his claim. Premise 1. If you ought to be a non-realist, then you should be able reasonably to think of reality in non-realist ways. However, you cannot think reasonably of reality in non-realist ways, therefore you ought to be a realist. Okay. So Gilson doesn't spend a great deal of time defending that idea in the opening paragraph of his handbook, but it seems fairly easy to see why the premise 2 is reasonable. Okay, what was premise 2? Just review that. Premise 2 is, however, you cannot reasonably think of reality in non-realist ways. Okay, so here's why premise 2 is reasonable. It's true. Okay? Just try getting what is to be non-realist. Just try it. Common sense realism maintains that what is, all things that exist, and existence itself are not dependent for what they are on human cognition, will, or feeling. In other words, reality doesn't depend on your feelings. Sometimes I wish it did. I'd be taller, skinnier, younger, wealthier, right? All those things. If reality just depended on how I feel, I'd surf better. Pick a lot of different things. Things would be much different if reality depended on how I feel. It seems easy enough to try the anti-realist approach. Yet, when specific cases arises, the absurdity seems obvious enough. The existence of gas in the tank of my car doesn't depend on how I feel. Now you might say, well, I drive an electric car. That's fine. The charge on your battery in your car doesn't depend on how you feel. Now, of course, I can pump gas into the tank, I can charge the car. But once the gas in the tank is there, its existing or not existing is irrelevant to anything within my cognitive capacities, functions, realizations, emotional states, family history, or social status, or anything else. Now, when I drive, I used to drive a Prius. Long story. Great car, by the way. Today's video brought to you by Prii. Okay. When I drive my car to the beach and try to squeeze in a late afternoon surf session before it gets dark, on my way home from work sometimes, I'll look at my gas gauge and realize it's 12 miles to the beach, but I only have a quarter of a mile left on the gas gauge. No matter how hard I try to think that reality, namely the gas in the tank, is dependent on my will, feelings, desires, beliefs, politics, genes, self-identity, or whatever, the amount of gas in the tank, it does not change. I think this is rather obvious to everyone. In fact, the gas in the tank is running dry. I might think this is unfair, oppressive, the result of societal bias against aging, hybrid driving surfers. But what is, namely the gas in my tank, doesn't change according to what I believe. Reality is real, regardless of how I feel. That's the second of 2 arguments from Gilson. We'll look at the next 2. Thanks for watching.
Stay psyched, Grom. You.